Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Coffee Talk. Today, we're going to talk about New York City housing and the imminent challenges that it faces. Today, we're going to talk to Jay Martin, who is the executive director of CHIP, which represents a lot of landlords and about 400,000 rent-stabilized units. Very plainly, can you explain to me the challenge of New York City housing?
The biggest challenge is that it's extremely expensive to operate housing in New York. And the law, in 2019, the law change essentially said that the cost, no matter what it is, doesn't matter. We're going to make sure that the rents stay as low as possible. And that dynamic has led to a massive disinvestment in the properties themselves, a massive devaluation of the properties, and even the lending institutions to these buildings are now suffering financially as well. We're comfortable saying that year over year, there's permanently unavailable 26,000 rent-stabilized units, and 3,000 to 5,000 units are added to that universe every year from folks simply passing away in their rent-stabilized apartments because they've lived in them for decades, usually senior citizens, or folks vacating those premises of their own volition. These aren't evictions. These are folks just simply leaving housing after decades of being in it, achieving the affordability or taking advantage of the affordability as they are entitled to, and then vacating with an apartment now at the rents that is set to what it was when they moved in. So 1984 rents in 2024 that we're now dealing with. And the question is, where does the money come from to keep the unit operating when the renovation cost is usually $100,000 on top of whatever the operating cost is?
Yeah.
Property owners talk to lawmakers all the time who say, well, we are in a housing shortage. Why not just rent it out? Mm-hmm. The problem with that mindset is over time, you rent out one unit at a loss, you rent out two units at a loss, you're no longer going to have enough money to keep the rest of the building operating for the rest of the people who live in that building.
Right.
Most people don't understand that rent stabilization is a system with no subsidy. It only functions.
It's subsidized by the owners,
by the owners, and how do they get the money? From other renters. Mm-hmm. So it actually requires them raising rents on other people in the building to offset the below market rents on other renters. The ability to dereg a unit, deregulation, when that became free market, that was your injection of revenue into the building to keep it operating.
And that was your incentive of buying housing because you thought that you would be able to eventually get some of those units to be market rate.
And the lawmakers see that as a negative. We saw that as that was really the only mechanism to keep the buildings functionally operating. And the banks were lending on that. I've also heard speculation as to why the buildings have lost value. We're looking at 70% devaluation, 50% devaluation. New York Community Bank, Signature Bank, Perforit are facing significant financial blowback because of this, but they were very strict underwriters. They don't underwrite loans. They're not allowed to legally, and the regulators would hammer them for this. They don't underwrite loans on speculative rent increases.
Yeah.
They were looking at the system as it was and determining what would be the general operating costs needed. Now they're looking at the system and in the loans that they have on the books to these buildings and saying, no matter what happens for this owner, the Rent Guidelines Board process and the vacancies staying at the current rent of the prior tenant prevents these buildings from ever catching up to their operating costs.
Where is the message lost on the politicians who voting on this stuff?
Yeah, I'll be honest. So I'm an outsider, and even in my own industry, because I think what happened in 2019 didn't start in 2019. It's been going on for decades. And it's a narrative that the average landlord in New York City has only one intent, and that is to evict somebody to get a higher rent. If you're a lawmaker, you're sitting in your office, somebody's calling every day, I need more affordable housing, I need more affordable housing. Then somebody else is calling saying, my apartment's not renovated. So who do you blame? You can't blame yourself. You have to blame the owner of the property.
Yeah.
The housing isn't affordable and it's not being maintained. Despite the fact that the property taxes are the reason it's not affordable. That's what keeps driving up the rent cost. And the regulation, the rent stabilization system in and of itself actually incentivizes not maintaining the housing.
Yeah, that's what you're suggesting, why rents have gone up so much in New York City in the last couple of years?
Yeah.
Because they've gone up significantly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. So they've gone up on completely free market units because of the demand. We saw during COVID a huge plummet in rents. Why? Everybody moved out of the city in those high rent neighborhoods in Manhattan. But where it didn't drop were in neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx where people weren't able to vacate. There wasn't a supply surge, the demand stayed. So rent stayed flat. In Manhattan, though, we saw the actual impact of adding supply to the demand need. We can do that across the city with more supply. But what we can also do is make sure that affordability is subsidized with more vouchers and actually working to lower the cost to operate this housing. The conversation about affordable housing is always on how do we make it cheaper for the renter? It should be, but how do we make it cheaper to operate this housing? How do we make it cheaper to build it?
You and I both know that rent-stabilized housing doesn't always go to people who need it the most.
That's correct.
I know a lot of people who are in rent-stabilized housing who are attorneys and who work in finance and who have like real good jobs, but they manage to secure a rent-stabilized unit for themselves. So not all of these units are necessarily going to the people who need it the most.
No, certainly not. We peg it at a little over 100,000 people who make at least six figures living in these apartments. So we don't have actual income numbers, but we think they're pretty well off living in these apartments. But a system that's based on incumbency, which is what this is, simply if you were born into it, and you can inherit it from a family member. You can inherit from a caregiver. You don't even have to be related to the person you inherit it from. You can inherit from a roommate if you're living with them long enough.
Wow.
That's the affordable housing system of New York City.
If we need more housing and 421A can allow developers to build housing with some subsidies by adding 25% of the units to be affordable, what's the logic behind not renewing that?
The argument against not renewing that from the kind of leftist, socialist, progressive lawmakers is that there's a loss of tax revenue in the billions of dollars. They peg it, I think it's like 1.4 billion a year is lost, given to developers, and they argue they have the money to build the housing without it. It is a Band-Aid at best, 421A, 421X, whatever it ends up being called. But it's necessary to spur that development, to make the numbers pencil out on the lending side, to make sure you're building this.
Because anything that was not in the pipeline is not, nobody's adding anything to the pipeline.
You don't lose tax revenue on nothing that's built.
Yeah,
if nothing is built, you're not losing anything. So the same argument was made around Amazon, we were going to lose all these tax subsidies. Well, nothing ended up being built. We didn't lose anything.
We lost a lot.
But we ended up losing the jobs.
Yeah.
But the argument in reverse is if we fixed our property tax code, we wouldn't even need 421A.
Yeah.
We could make it pencil out on developing more housing regardless, whether or not you have a tax revenue or not.
You've been saying since 2019 that there's going to be a lot of foreclosures of these rent-stabilized sort of buildings, but there hasn't really been that many. I mean, what do you count that to?
Well, it's starting. It's starting now. In fact, you all reported just 2 days ago of the uptick, 10 foreclosures in one portfolio, folks selling at 70% discount. The other thing is to remember the difference between operating in the green and in the red on a rent-stabilized building is very thin. The margins were always close to about 2 to 5%.
Yeah.
So what the law did in 2019 is made it negative 2 to 5%. So it's very thin. The other thing is banks don't want them back.
Right.
What are they going to do with them?
Right. There's this theory, I don't know if it's valid or if it's a conspiracy theory, but that the socialists and the progressives want to make rental housing so worthless that the state will eventually have to take over.
I have heard that theory, and I believe some socialists ascribe to that theory. Do I believe the entire legislature does? No. I think most of the legislature doesn't, but I think there is an active, very vocal, very organized group of socialist lawmakers who were not only the advocates of the 2019 law, but have now proposed subsequent laws that would create a massive fund of money for the government to now buy back these buildings that have been devalued and turn them over to public housing. So I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think they're pretty obvious and they're pretty frank in their intent.
Real estate is such a powerful industry, and look, whether they're losing money right now or not, as a cumulative group, they're very powerful, they're very wealthy. Why can't you guys organize to target certain politicians that are in the way of housing policy?
Money in campaigns buys power in the sense that it buys people to help you run a campaign. Door knocking, canvassers, volunteers, voter outreach. Well, the socialists have that. They have an energized base. They don't need $1 million to run a campaign. They can do it for $50,000, and they have people willing to and the time to spend 7-8 hours a day knocking on doors of their neighbors to get out the vote. That, to me, negates any major donation from a political candidate to someone else. So like the playing field is even. You can take a donation or you can show up with 50 volunteers. To me, if I'm running a campaign, I'll take the 50 volunteers because that equals people talking to other voters about getting out the vote. So that has really changed the game. And I think the socialists, to their credit, have shown that if you run nuts and bolts campaigns in New York, you can change the political dynamic. And that has really upended the power structure.
There are basically three organizations that represent real estate. So REBNY, RSA, and CHIP, which is your organization. You're the smallest out of the group in terms of money and people and stuff.
Yep.
And you guys are spending about $50,000 a month trying to sort of push this messaging, which I'm not sure if any of it is as effective as your Twitter account, because Jay is a very effective tweeter. Is that the term? So he actually gets the message across to the right people very nicely through his account. So definitely follow him on that. It's at J Martin. Is that
JJ Mart 222.
There you go. And but you guys are spending $50,000 a month. First, you should take some of that money and verify your account so you can reach more people. But second, are you guys going to go bankrupt because you're not pulling in enough money to be able to spend that kind of money?
Yeah, we're not. No, we've budgeted it out. We're not going to go bankrupt. And you know, the Twitter account thing, and everybody talks to me about it. It kind of came out of the fact that we were the third and smallest organization. We didn't have a lot of resources, so Twitter's free, and my time is I define how worthy my time is, how expensive it is. So if I can have time to type out a tweet, then it's essentially that's the cost.
Yeah.
So lawmakers are on Twitter, the press is on Twitter, so that's my audience.
Yeah.
So why aren't I there? And I think any group or organization that isn't on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram,
I'm 100% with you. I mean, it's a great platform to get your message across, and I think that's what made you so effective because you're prolific.
It's also where our opponents are. So, like, if we're not constantly engaged in those demographic conversations where they're happening, then we 100% have to do that. So, no, we're not going bankrupt. We have it budgeted out through session. But
there's talks of you and RSA merging powers and becoming one.
There are talks about that, yeah.
And what would your role be in that sort of a situation?
I would hope the boards of both organizations seek to let me keep doing what I'm doing.
Very plainly, if you had to fix, you had a magic wand and you could fix housing for the city, very plainly, can you explain what that would look like?
Rapidly increase supply while lowering the overall cost to build.
And that's it?
Yeah.